The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Beatrice Dawson crawled through the dust of the barren Wyoming landscape, her torn dress dragging behind her like a tattered flag of surrender. She had been running for 2 days, escaping the man who had promised to love her but delivered only pain. Her parched lips cracked as she pulled herself forward, one elbow after another, the distant silhouette of a small trading post her only hope in the vast emptiness of 1876 frontier country. Frank Holloway spotted the figure from half a mile away, his keen eyes narrowed against the harsh glare of the setting sun. 7 years as a frontier lawman before turning to ranching had taught him to recognize trouble, and the woman dragging herself across the plains spelled nothing but. He clicked his tongue, urging his stallion forward, his hand instinctively resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. "Easy there," he murmured, approaching the woman cautiously. His horse snorted, sensing his tension. When he reached her, Frank dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a dull thud. He crouched beside the woman, taking in her condition with a practiced eye. Her face was nearly unrecognizable beneath layers of dust and bruises, her blonde hair matted with blood and dirt. Her blue dress, once fine by the looks of the fabric, hung in tatters around her trembling form. "Madam," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Can you hear me?" Beatrice flinched at the sound of a man's voice, curling into herself like a wounded animal. Her eyes, bright green despite the grime surrounding them, darted wildly as she tried to push herself away. "Please," she whispered, her voice a ragged shadow of what it once had been. "Please don't." Frank removed his hat, holding his empty hands up where she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm Frank Holloway. I own the Double H Ranch about 5 miles east of here. I'd like to help you if you'll let me." She stared at him, suspicion warring with desperation in her eyes. Frank knew that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of abused wives and frightened children during his time wearing a badge. "He'll find me," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder at the empty horizon. "He always does." Frank's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening as he surveyed the damage done to the woman before him. Whoever had done this deserved nothing short of a hanging, and if the law wouldn't provide it, well. Frontier justice had its own methods. "No one's laying a hand on you again," he said, the promise in his words as solid as iron. "Not while I'm breathing." For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed Beatrice's battered face. She swallowed hard, wincing at the pain the simple action caused. "My name is Beatrice," she managed. "Beatrice Dawson." Frank nodded, moving slowly as he removed his canteen from his saddle. "Miss Dawson, I'd like to take you to my ranch where you can get cleaned up and see to those injuries. Would that be all right?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Frank handed her the canteen, watching as she took small, careful sips of water. "Can you ride?" he asked, eyeing her condition doubtfully. Beatrice attempted to stand but collapsed almost immediately, her legs buckling beneath her. Frank caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms steady and gentle. "I've got you," he said, lifting her as carefully as possible. He felt her stiffen at his touch, then gradually relax as she realized he wasn't going to hurt her. "I'll take it slow. You just hold on to me." With practiced ease, Frank mounted his horse with Beatrice cradled against his chest. He arranged his duster around her, providing what little protection he could against the approaching night chill. "Whoever did this to you," he said quietly as they set off toward his ranch, "they'll answer for it. That's a promise." Beatrice said nothing, but her hand tightened slightly on the front of his shirt. As they rode east toward the Double H, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind them, darkness settling over the land like a heavy blanket. Frank's ranch house came into view after an hour of slow riding. It wasn't grand by any means, a solid 2-story structure built of logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A barn stood nearby, along with a bunkhouse for the handful of men Frank employed. As they approached, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Martha Wilson had been Frank's housekeeper since he bought the place 3 years ago, following the death of his brother in a cattle rustling incident. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Holloway," she called, then stopped short when she saw the bundle in his arms. "Good Lord, what's happened?" "Martha, this is Miss Dawson," Frank said, carefully dismounting while keeping Beatrice secure in his arms. "She needs our help." Martha's expression shifted from shock to determination in an instant. "Bring her inside. I'll heat water and prepare the spare room." Frank carried Beatrice into the house and up the stairs to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a pine dresser, and a washstand. "You're safe here," he told Beatrice as he set her gently on the bed. "Martha will help you get cleaned up. She's got a good hand with injuries, too." Beatrice looked around the unfamiliar room, her eyes wide with apprehension. "What if he comes looking for me?" Frank's expression hardened. "Let him try." Martha bustled into the room carrying towels and a basin of steaming water. "Out with you now, Mr. Holloway," she said firmly. "The young lady needs tending, and it's not proper for you to be here." Frank nodded, backing toward the door. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Anything at all." After he left, Martha turned to Beatrice with kind eyes. "Now then, let's get you out of these ruined clothes and see what needs mending." With gentle hands, Martha helped Beatrice undress, her face growing grimmer with each new bruise and cut revealed. The older woman worked silently, washing away the dirt and blood with warm water and soft cloths, applying salve to the worst of the injuries. "Who did this to you, child?" Martha finally asked as she helped Beatrice into a clean nightgown. Beatrice stared at her hands, now scrubbed clean but still trembling. "My husband," she whispered.
Benjamin Porter.
Martha's hand stilled. "The Benjamin Porter?" "Owner of the Porter Mining Company." Beatrice nodded miserably. "We've been married for 2 years. He was different when we were courting. Charming. Kind." Her voice broke. "It changed after the wedding. He has a terrible temper." "This is more than a temper," Martha said firmly. "This is wickedness, plain and simple." "He'll come for me," Beatrice said, fear creeping back into her voice. "He has connections. Men who work for him. He'll find me." Martha patted her hand. "You let Mr. Holloway worry about that. Rest now. You're safe tonight." Downstairs, Frank paced the length of his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. The fury he felt was cold and precise, a lawman's anger rather than a hothead's rage. When Martha entered the room, closing the door quietly behind her, he stopped pacing and looked at her expectantly. "She's resting now," Martha reported. "But it's bad, Mr. Holloway. That girl's been beaten something fierce. Broken ribs, for certain. Cuts and bruises everywhere. And those are just the injuries I can see." Frank's hand tightened around the back of a chair. "Did she say who did this to her?" Martha nodded grimly. "Benjamin Porter. She's his wife." The name landed like a physical blow. Benjamin Porter was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, owner of several silver mines and a good portion of the town of Silver Creek, 20 miles to the west. He had influence with judges, politicians, and lawmen throughout Wyoming. "Porter," Frank repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "I've heard stories about him. Never anything that could be proven." "She's terrified he'll find her," Martha said. "And with his resources, he probably will." Frank walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. "Not if I can help it." The next morning, Beatrice woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, panic seized her as she tried to remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back her escape, crawling through the dust, the cowboy who had saved her. She sat up slowly, wincing at the pain that radiated through her body. Someone had placed a simple cotton dress at the foot of the bed, along with undergarments and a pair of soft leather slippers. With careful movements, Beatrice dressed herself, grateful for clothes that weren't torn and filthy. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Martha in the hallway, carrying a tray with toast and tea. "Good morning, Mrs. Porter," Martha said gently. "I was just bringing you some breakfast." "Please," Beatrice said quickly, "call me Beatrice." I don't want to be Mrs. Porter anymore." Martha nodded understanding. "Beatrice, then. Come downstairs when you're ready. Mr. Holloway would like to speak with you." Beatrice followed Martha down the stairs, taking in her surroundings properly for the first time. The house was solidly built but sparsely furnished, with a few good pieces mixed among more utilitarian items. It spoke of a man who valued quality but had little interest in show. Frank was seated at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood when Beatrice entered, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Miss Dawson," he said, deliberately using her maiden name. "You look better this morning." It was a kind lie. Though clean and in fresh clothes, Beatrice knew her face was a mass of bruises, one eye swollen nearly shut. But the simple courtesy of his words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "For everything." "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Food?" She shook her head, lowering herself carefully into the offered chair. "The tea is fine, thank you." Frank sat across from her, his expression turning serious. "Miss Dawson, I need to ask you some questions. About your husband. About what happened." Beatrice's hands tightened around her teacup. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you're willing to tell me," Frank said simply. "I want to help you, but I need to understand what we're facing." Beatrice took a deep breath, then began to speak. She told him about meeting Benjamin Porter when she was 19, a schoolteacher newly arrived in Silver Creek. How he had courted her with flowers and poetry, promising her a life of comfort and respect. How the first blow had come just weeks after their wedding, a slap that had shocked her to her core. "He apologized afterward," she said, her voice distant as she recalled that first betrayal. "Brought me diamonds and begged my forgiveness. Said it would never happen again." Frank listened silently, his face impassive, but his eyes grew harder with each new detail of abuse and manipulation. "It got worse after I lost the baby," Beatrice continued, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. 8 months ago. He said it was my fault. That I was defective." Martha made a soft sound of distress from where she stood by the stove, but Frank remained silent, letting Beatrice tell her story at her own pace. 2 days ago, he came home drunk. Angrier than I'd ever seen him, he said. Her voice faltered. He said he was going to replace me with someone who could give him sons. That no one would miss me if I disappeared. Frank's knuckles whitened where they rested on the table. "That's when you ran." She nodded. "I waited until he passed out, took what money I could find, and slipped out. I was heading for the train station in Laramie, but he sent men after me. They caught up with my stagecoach about 10 miles from here. I managed to escape into the hills, but I lost everything, my bag, the money, everything. And that's when I found you," Frank finished. "Yes." Beatrice looked up at him, vulnerability and determination warring in her green eyes. "Mr. Holloway, I know I have no right to ask for your protection, but I have nowhere else to go, and Benjamin. He won't stop looking for me." Frank leaned forward, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Miss Dawson, I meant what I said yesterday. No one is going to hurt you again. Not while I'm around. Benjamin has influence," she warned.
Money.
"Men who will do whatever he asks." A smile that held no humor curved Frank's lips. "I was a U.S. Marshal for 7 years before I bought this ranch. I've dealt with men like Benjamin Porter before. Men who think their money puts them above the law. Martha set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Frank, then one before Beatrice. Eat, she instructed. Both of you. Can't fight battles on empty stomachs. As they ate, Frank outlined his plan. First, we need to establish your legal standing. Wyoming territory has divorce laws that favor women more than most places. Cruelty is grounds for divorce here. Beatrice looked up in surprise. Divorce? I never thought. It's your decision, Frank said quickly. But it would make it harder for him to claim you as his property. Beatrice considered this, then nodded slowly.
Yes.
I want to be free of him. Completely.
Good.
I know a lawyer in Cheyenne who can help. In the meantime, you'll stay here. My ranch hands are loyal men. They'll keep watch. Beatrice set down her fork, looking troubled. I don't want to bring danger to your home, Mr. Holloway. Frank's expression softened. Miss Dawson, helping people in trouble is what I've done my whole life. First with a badge, now without one. I'm not about to stop now. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house. Frank was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. It's just Bill, he said, relaxing slightly as he recognized his foreman. But he's riding hard. Frank stepped out onto the porch as Bill Matthews reined in his lathered horse. The foreman, a weathered man in his 40s, dismounted quickly. Trouble, boss, he said without preamble. Ran into some men in town asking questions about a blonde woman. Offering money for information. Frank's expression darkened. Porter's men. Bill nodded. That's my guess. They're being careful about it, not mentioning names, but they're armed and they don't look like the type to take no for an answer. How many? For that I saw. Could be more. Frank nodded, his mind already working through options. Bill, I want you to double the watch around the ranch. No one comes or goes without me knowing about it. Yes, sir. What about the cattle drive? We're supposed to move the herd to the north pasture tomorrow. Frank considered this. Proceed as planned. I don't want to give any indication that something's different here. But keep your eyes open. As Bill rode off to carry out his instructions, Frank returned to the kitchen where Beatrice sat rigid with fear, having overheard the conversation. He's found me already, she whispered. Frank shook his head. He's looking, but he hasn't found you yet. And we're going to make sure he doesn't. Over the next 3 days, a tense calm settled over the Double H Ranch. Frank sent a rider to Cheyenne with a letter for his lawyer friend, outlining Beatrice's situation and requesting guidance on divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, Beatrice gradually regained her strength, though her bruises were slow to fade. Despite the circumstances, she found herself drawn to the quiet, capable rancher who had offered her sanctuary. Frank Holloway was unlike any man she had ever known, steady, honest, and unfailingly respectful. He asked for her opinions and actually listened to her answers. He never raised his voice, never made sudden movements around her, as if he understood instinctively how to put her at ease. On the 4th morning, Beatrice ventured out onto the porch, breathing in the cool morning air. The sun was just cresting the eastern hills, painting the landscape in gold and amber. From her vantage point, she could see Frank in the corral, working with a young horse, his movements patient and deliberate as he guided the animal through its paces. Martha joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. He's good with them, the older woman observed, following Beatrice's gaze. The wild ones, especially, has a way of earning their trust. Beatrice nodded, watching as Frank spoke softly to the horse, his hand steady on its neck. He's a good man, isn't he? One of the best I've known, Martha agreed. Been through his share of hardship, though. Lost his parents young. Then his brother Thomas 3 years back, that's when he left the Marshalls and bought this place. Thomas's dream was to have a ranch. After he died, Mr. Holloway made it happen like a tribute. Beatrice sipped her coffee, absorbing this information. He never married? Martha gave her a sidelong glance, a knowing look in her eyes.
No.
There was a girl once, back when he was wearing a badge. She didn't care for the danger of his work, chose a banker instead. She paused. He doesn't speak of it, but I think it left its mark. In the corral, Frank had mounted the horse and was now guiding it in a wide circle, his body moving in perfect harmony with the animal. There was something mesmerizing about his quiet confidence, the gentle authority he projected. "Miss Beatrice," Martha said after a moment, "if you don't mind my saying so, you've been looking at Mr. Holloway like he hung the moon and stars." Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm still married, Martha." "Only on paper," the housekeeper replied pragmatically. "And hopefully not for much longer." Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Frank immediately dismounted, his hand moving to his gun as he scanned the horizon. 3 riders were approaching from the east, moving at a steady pace. As they drew closer, Frank relaxed slightly, recognizing the man in the lead. "It's Sheriff Taylor," he called to Beatrice and Martha. "And that's James Knox with him, my lawyer friend from Cheyenne." Beatrice retreated slightly into the shadow of the porch, anxiety tightening her chest. Frank quickly crossed to her, his expression reassuring. "It's all right," he said softly. "Sheriff Taylor is an old friend from my martial days. He can be trusted." The 3 men dismounted in front of the house. Sheriff Michael Taylor was a tall, lean man with a salt and pepper mustache and shrewd eyes. James Knox was younger, dressed in an Eastern-cut suit that looked out of place on the frontier. The 3rd man was a deputy, young and nervous-looking. "Frank," Sheriff Taylor greeted, shaking hands with his old friend. "Wish this was a social call." Frank's expression grew serious. "What's happened?" "Benjamin Porter has filed charges," Knox said, stepping forward. "He's claiming his wife has been kidnapped and is being held against her will." Beatrice made a small sound of distress. Frank moved closer to her, his presence solid and reassuring. "That's ridiculous," he said flatly. "Miss Dawson came here of her own free will after escaping an abusive husband." Sheriff Taylor sighed. "I know that, Frank. But Porter has influence. He's demanding a search of your property and Miss Dawson's immediate return to his custody." "I won't go back," Beatrice said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. "He'll kill me." Knox held up a hand. "No one's taking you anywhere against your will, Mrs. Porter. I've already filed divorce papers on your behalf, citing extreme cruelty. Under Wyoming territory law, you have the right to separate from your husband while the proceedings are underway." Relief washed over Beatrice, quickly followed by suspicion. "Benjamin won't accept that. He doesn't believe the law applies to him." "Which is why we're here," Sheriff Taylor said grimly. "Porter and his men were seen heading this way about an hour behind us. 4 of them, all armed." Frank's expression hardened. 5 against 4. Not bad odds. 6, Beatrice said firmly. "I can shoot." All eyes turned to her in surprise. She lifted her chin defiantly. "My father taught me. Before I became a schoolteacher. Before I met Benjamin." Frank studied her for a moment, then nodded. 6 it is. "Martha, take the rifle from my study and watch the back of the house." As they prepared for Porter's arrival, positioning themselves strategically around the property, Knox pulled Frank aside. "There's something else you should know," the lawyer said in a low voice. "Porter's been implicated in some shady business dealings. The territorial governor has ordered an investigation into his mining operations, accusations of claim jumping, intimidation, even murder." Frank's eyebrows rose. "When did this happen?" "The order came down 3 days ago. Porter doesn't know yet." Knox glanced toward Beatrice, who was checking the chamber of a revolver with practiced hands. It might explain why he's so desperate to get his wife back. She may know things that could incriminate him. This new information settled in Frank's mind, adding another layer to his determination to protect Beatrice. It wasn't just about saving her from an abusive husband anymore, it was about justice on a larger scale. The wait was tense, each minute stretching like an hour. Beatrice positioned herself at an upstairs window, the revolver steady in her hands despite her fear. From her vantage point, she could see the approach to the ranch from all directions. Frank had stationed himself on the porch, Sheriff Taylor and his deputy by the barn, and Knox inside the house with Martha. Just after noon, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of riders. Beatrice's heart hammered in her chest as she recognized the lead figure, Benjamin Porter, sitting tall and imperious on his black stallion, flanked by 3 hired guns. "They're here," she called down to Frank, her voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. Frank stepped out into the yard as the riders approached, his stance relaxed but alert, one hand resting casually near his holster. Sheriff Taylor emerged from the barn, positioning himself to Frank's right. Benjamin Porter reined in his horse about 20 yards from the house, his cold gaze sweeping the property before settling on Frank. He was a handsome man in his 40s, with carefully styled dark hair and expensive clothes. Nothing in his polished appearance suggested the cruelty Beatrice had described. "Holloway," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Frank's expression remained impassive. "There's nothing here that belongs to you, Porter." Porter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My wife, Beatrice. She's had a nervous episode, you see. Not well at all. Her mind is fragile." "Your wife seems perfectly sound of mind to me," Frank replied evenly. "Sound enough to know she doesn't want to return to a man who beats her." Porter's facade slipped momentarily, anger flashing across his features before he composed himself. "These are serious accusations, Holloway, and none of your concern. Beatrice is my wife, and I have the legal right to take her home." Sheriff Taylor stepped forward. "Not anymore, Porter. Divorce proceedings have been filed. Under territorial law, your wife has the right to live separately from you while the case is decided." Porter's gaze shifted to the sheriff, his contempt evident. "A backwater sheriff and a rancher think they can stand against me? Do you have any idea who I am? What I can do?" "We know exactly who you are," Frank said, his voice hardening. "A coward who beats women. A thief who steals claims from honest miners. Maybe even a murderer." Porter's composure cracked completely at these words. His face contorted with rage as he turned to his men. "Take the house. Bring me my wife. Kill anyone who interferes." The hired guns drew their weapons, but Frank and Sheriff Taylor were faster. Gunfire erupted, shattering the midday quiet. Beatrice squeezed off a shot from her window, clipping one of Porter's men in the shoulder and sending him tumbling from his horse. From her position, she could see Frank moving with the practiced precision of a seasoned lawman, his shots measured and accurate. One of Porter's men fell, clutching his leg. Another took cover behind a water trough, exchanging fire with the deputy. Benjamin himself had dismounted and was using his horse as cover, his expensive pistol blazing as he fired toward the house. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Beatrice's head, sending wood fragments flying. She ducked down, heart pounding, then steadied herself and rose to fire again. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, though to Beatrice it seemed an eternity. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Porter's men were wounded but alive. The third had surrendered, hands raised high. And Benjamin Porter lay sprawled in the dust, blood spreading across his fine brocade vest. Frank approached him cautiously, gun still trained on the fallen man. "It's over, Porter," he said quietly. Porter's eyes found Frank's, hatred burning in them even as the light began to fade. "She's mine," he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Always."
"Meaning?"
"No," Frank said, his voice firm but not unkind. "She belongs to herself. She always did." Porter's eyes widened slightly, as if this concept was entirely foreign to him. Then, with a final rattling breath, he was gone. Beatrice stood frozen at the window, the revolver suddenly heavy in her hands. She had wanted freedom from Benjamin, but never like this. Never with more bloodshed. Slowly, she set the gun down and made her way downstairs on trembling legs. Outside, Sheriff Taylor was securing the surviving hired guns while Knox examined the body of Benjamin Porter. Frank stood apart from them, his expression unreadable as he stared at the man he had killed. When he saw Beatrice emerge from the house, something in his face softened. He crossed to her quickly, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head, unable to look away from the body of her husband. "Is he?" "Yes," Frank said simply. "I'm sorry it ended this way." Beatrice felt tears welling in her eyes, though whether from relief or shock or some complex mixture of emotions she couldn't name, she wasn't sure. "I never wanted anyone to die." Frank's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "I know, but he didn't leave us any choice." Sheriff Taylor approached them, his expression grim but satisfied. "It was clean, Frank. Self-defense, clear as day. Porter fired first, and he meant to kill. Every man here will testify to that." Knox joined them, brushing dust from his suit. "Mrs. Porter, Miss Dawson," he corrected himself, "with your husband's death, the divorce proceedings are no longer necessary. As his widow, you're entitled to his estate under Wyoming law." Beatrice looked at the lawyer in disbelief. "His estate? I don't want anything of his." "Nevertheless, it's yours," Knox said. "The house in Silver Creek, his shares in the mining company, his accounts. Everything." The enormity of this change in fortune was too much for Beatrice to process. Just days ago, she had been crawling through the dust, certain she would die. Now she was a wealthy widow, free to do as she pleased. "I need to sit down," she murmured, suddenly light-headed. Frank's arm came around her waist, steady and supportive as he guided her to the porch steps. He sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance while still remaining close enough to offer comfort. "What will you do now?" he asked after a moment of silence. Beatrice stared out at the horizon, considering the question. "I don't know. I never thought I'd be free of him. Never dared to plan beyond escape." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You have time now. No need to decide everything today." She turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing the man who had risked everything to protect a stranger. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His eyes were a clear, steady blue honest eyes that met hers without flinching. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving my life, for believing me when I told you about Benjamin, for treating me like a person with value." Frank's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me for seeing what's plain as day, Miss Dawson. You have more courage than most men I've known." A small smile touched her lips. "Beatrice. Please call me Beatrice." "Beatrice," he repeated, her name sounding different and his voice respectful, but with a warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. In the days that followed, Beatrice remained at the Double H Ranch while the legal matters surrounding Benjamin's death and estate were settled. Knox traveled to Silver Creek to inventory Benjamin's holdings and ensure Beatrice's legal claim was established. Sheriff Taylor took the surviving hired guns to Cheyenne to face charges for their role in the attack on the ranch. Gradually, as the immediate crisis faded, Beatrice found herself settling into a new rhythm of life. She helped Martha with household tasks, spent time reading books from Frank's surprisingly extensive library, and even began to assist with some of the lighter ranch work. The physical activity was healing, helping her reconnect with her body after years of abuse had made her feel disconnected from it. Frank was unfailingly kind but careful to maintain a proper distance. He treated her with respect that bordered on formality, as if aware of the vulnerable position she was in and determined not to take advantage. But Beatrice caught him watching her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice a look in his eyes that made her wonder if he felt the same growing attraction she did. One evening, about 2 weeks after Benjamin's death, Beatrice found Frank sitting alone on the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand as he watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "May I join you?" she asked softly. He looked up, surprise and pleasure crossing his features. "Of course." She settled into the chair beside him, smoothing her skirts. The bruises on her face had faded to yellowish shadows, and she had regained some of the weight she'd lost during her ordeal. The woman who had crawled through the dust was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who was beginning to believe in possibilities again. "Knox sent a telegram," she said after a comfortable silence. "The legal matters are settled. I officially own everything now." Frank nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey. "What will you do with it all?" Beatrice had been thinking about this question for days. "Sell the house. I never want to set foot in that place again. As for the mining company," she paused, considering, "I want to make it right. Benjamin hurt a lot of people building his fortune. I want to use it to help them somehow." Frank's expression was approving. "That's a fine idea." Another silence fell between them, comfortable but charged with unspoken things. Finally, Beatrice gathered her courage. "Mr. Holloway, Frank," she corrected herself. "I'll be leaving soon. To start my new life." His face remained carefully neutral, though she thought she saw a flicker of something disappointment in his eyes. "Where will you go?" "I'm not sure yet." She turned to face him fully. "I wanted to thank you properly before I left. For everything you've done." Frank set his glass down, his movements deliberate. "You don't owe me anything, Beatrice." "It's not about owing," she said softly. "It's about wanting to express my gratitude."
My.
She hesitated, then continued. "My feelings." His eyes met hers, searching. "Your feelings?" Beatrice took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been long. I know I'm still healing. But I've come to care for you, Frank. More than I should, perhaps." Frank was very still, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Beatrice," he said finally, his voice low and careful, "you've been through a terrible ordeal. It would be natural to feel attached to someone who helped you." She shook her head, a flash of frustration cutting through her nervousness. "Don't do that. Don't dismiss what I feel as mere gratitude or confusion. I've had enough of men telling me what I think and feel." Frank looked startled, then chagrined. "You're right. I apologize. I know my own mind," she continued, her voice steadier now. "Yes, I'm grateful to you. Yes, I'm still healing. But what I feel is separate from that. It's about who you are, your kindness, your integrity, your strength. The way you look at me like I matter." Frank's expression softened, the careful mask slipping to reveal something vulnerable beneath. "You do matter, Beatrice. More than I can say." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and gentle, his calloused fingers curling around hers with exquisite care. "I've come to care for you too," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I didn't want to burden you with that. Not when you're just beginning to reclaim your freedom." Beatrice smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "It's not a burden, Frank. It's a gift." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Frank leaned forward. Beatrice met him halfway, her heart pounding as their lips met in a kiss that was gentle, yet filled with promise. Unlike Benjamin's demanding, possessive kisses, this was an exchange, a conversation without words, a question and an answer. When they separated, Frank's eyes were bright with emotion. "I don't want you to leave," he said simply. "But I want even less to cage you when you've just found your wings." Beatrice touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with tender fingers. What if staying isn't a cage, but a choice? My choice. The smile that spread across Frank's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then I'd say you're welcome to stay as long as you wish, Miss Dawson. And if I wish to stay forever? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank's hand tightened around hers. Then I'd be the most fortunate man in Wyoming territory. As summer turned to autumn, the Double H Ranch flourished under the combined care of Frank and Beatrice. With her inheritance, they expanded the operation, buying additional land and improving the breeding stock. But more important than the material improvements was the sense of partnership that grew between them, two people who had found in each other not just love, but respect and understanding. They were married on a clear October day, with Sheriff Taylor standing as Frank's best man and Martha serving as Beatrice's matron of honor. The ceremony was small but joyful, held on the porch where they had shared their first kiss. Beatrice wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her golden hair adorned with wildflowers. As she walked toward Frank, she thought of how far she had come from that desperate woman crawling through the dust. The bruises had healed, but the lessons remained about strength, about resilience, about the capacity of the human heart to recover and love again. Frank watched her approach with wonder in his eyes, scarcely able to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen him. When she reached his side, he took her hands in his, thumbs brushing gently over her knuckles. Beautiful, he murmured, for her ears alone. The preacher, brought in from Cheyenne for the occasion, began the ceremony. When it came time for the vows, Frank spoke his with the same quiet certainty that had marked all his promises to Beatrice. I, Frank Holloway, take you, Beatrice Dawson, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to cherish and respect you, to support your dreams as my own, to be your partner in all things. I will protect you without possessing you, love you without limiting you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings. This I vow, until death parts us. Tears shimmered in Beatrice's eyes as she repeated her own vows, her voice clear and strong despite her emotion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed her with tender reverence, sealing their promises with an action as gentle as it was profound. The celebration afterward was lively, with ranch hands and neighbors joining in the festivities. As twilight fell, Frank led Beatrice away from the gathering to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. In the distance, the mountains stood purple against the darkening sky, eternal and unchanging. Happy? He asked, his arm around her waist. Beatrice leaned into him, savoring the solid warmth of his presence. More than I ever thought possible. Frank's lips brushed her temple. You know, when I found you that day, covered in dust and bruises, something inside me knew. Even then. Knew what? She asked, turning to look up at him. His smile was tender, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing above them. That you were the strongest person I'd ever met. That if you survived, you'd be extraordinary. Beatrice reached up to touch his face, tracing the beloved features with gentle fingers. I survived because of you. Frank shook his head.
No.
You survived because of you. I just had the good fortune to find you and witness your courage. As darkness settled over the land, they stood together on the ridge, two people who had found in each other not completion, but complement each whole on their own, yet somehow more together than apart. Below them, lights glowed in the windows of the ranch house, a beacon of home and safety in the vast wilderness. No one will ever hurt you again, Frank murmured, echoing the promise he had made when they first met. Not while I'm breathing. Beatrice smiled up at him, her heart full. And no one will hurt you either, she replied. Not while I'm breathing. It was a new vow, an equal one, a promise not of possession or protection, but of partnership. As they walked hand in hand back toward the celebration, Beatrice thought how far she had come from that desperate day in the dust. She had found not just safety, but joy, not just freedom from pain, but the freedom to love and be loved in return. In the years that followed, the legend of Frank and Beatrice Holloway grew throughout the territory. They were known for their fair dealings, their generosity to those in need, and their unwavering support of each other. The Double H Ranch became a haven for those seeking a fresh start, abused wives, struggling families, people who needed a second chance. Beatrice used her inheritance to establish a school on the ranch property, teaching the children of ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. She also funded a women's shelter in Cheyenne, providing a safe place for those escaping situations like the one she had survived. Frank continued to work alongside his men, leading by example rather than command. Together with Beatrice, he built something rare in the harsh landscape of the frontier, a community based on mutual respect and compassion rather than mere survival. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, was born in the spring following their wedding. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet strength. 2 years later, a son joined the family, Thomas, named for Frank's fallen brother. As the children grew, they absorbed their parents' values, courage, kindness, and the unshakable belief that love should lift up, never diminish. On the 5th anniversary of the day Frank had found Beatrice crawling through the dust, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Frank's arm was around Beatrice's waist, her head resting against his shoulder, a posture of comfortable intimacy that had become as natural as breathing. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Beatrice asked softly. "If you hadn't found me that day?" Frank considered this, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I believe some things are meant to be. Not in a way that denies our choices, but in a way that honors them. I chose to ride out that day. You chose to escape, to survive. And every day since, we've chosen each other." Beatrice smiled, turning in his arms to face him. At 30, she was more beautiful than ever, not despite what she had endured, but because of how she had overcome it. The frightened, battered woman was gone, replaced by someone who carried her scars with dignity and her joy with gratitude. "The best choice I ever made," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Frank's arms tightened around her, his love as steady and enduring as the mountains that guarded their valley. "Mine too," he murmured against her lips. "Every single day." As the sun set over the Double H Ranch, painting the sky in the same colors that had witnessed their first meeting, Frank and Beatrice Holloway stood embraced in the life they had built together, a life founded on respect, strengthened by challenges, and illuminated by a love that had begun with a promise made to a woman covered in dust and bruises. "No one's laying a hand on you again." It was a promise kept, and so much more.